Cortisol, this is your body's stress hormone, and it is great for short-term survival, but it does wreak havoc if chronically elevated. So if we dig a little bit deeper into cortisol and how it operates throughout the body, to really understand the impact on fat loss and overall health, we need to cover these three areas: the feedback loop, the concept of allostatic load, and the different types of stressors that trigger it. Now, when you look, you have a stressful situation, a stressor, a trigger in any form or fashion. This can be mental, physical, emotional. It activates the hypothalamus in the brain. The hypothalamus releases CRH, corticotropin releasing hormone, with the signal to the pituitary to release adrenocorticotropic hormone, ACTH. Now, the ACTH travels through the blood to the adrenal glands. These are the glands, they sit on top of your kidneys. They prompt them to release cortisol into the bloodstream. Now, cortisol does its job. It mobilizes energy by raising blood sugar, breaking down muscle, so proteolysis, and suppressing non-essential systems like digestion, reproduction. So this is what we're seeing when we see anovulation, amenorrhea. This ensures you have the energy to deal with said stressors. So your body, understand that like your body is so smart, and it is always looking to work to achieve and maintain homeostasis. There's a stressful situation, there's a stress response, it's always looking to correct. And it's not a bad thing. And when cortisol levels rise to an appropriate level, the brain receives this feedback signal to reduce those two first hormones, CRH and ACTH production. This lowers cortisol output and helps the body return to that homeostasis. Now, the problem arises when stressors are constant or overwhelming. Instead of cortisol levels rising briefly and then coming back down, the feedback loop gets disrupted. Your body stays in this constant state of stress, keeping cortisol levels elevated for an extended period of time. And over time, the brain becomes desensitized to the feedback signal and the HPA axis becomes dysregulated. Now, this can lead to two scenarios. Chronically elevated cortisol, the system keeps pumping out cortisol, leading to belly fat storage, so visceral fat gain, sleep disruption, and muscle breakdown. So think about when you're experiencing like that heightened like focus and like it's quite productive in the morning, like that is cortisol giving you the energy to go about your day. Now, when we're seeing those elevations even at night, despite poor sleep, that could indicate that cortisol cycle, that undulation of cortisol is dysregulated or dysfunctional. Now, cortisol burnout, adrenal fatigue-like state, which is a concept that is heavily challenged in the medical community, but for this application, let's just explore it. The system becomes exhausted and cortisol levels drop too low, leaving you feeling fatigued, burned out, and unable to handle stress. Now, this is something that I would say is a little more advanced and not necessarily what I see is incurred even through contest prep. So to give context here, like there are individuals I'm sure who've gone through contest prep who the contest prep itself pushed them over the edge and led them to cortisol burnout or something of that or the other, where they needed severe intervention to re-regulate. But this isn't something I vastly see. I do see most people able to manage the stress of contest prep and come out of it without experiencing cortisol burnout. Because as I was like putting this together, I was like, I think a lot of people are going to assume, well, prep is so extreme. Like you talk so much shit on prep and so hard. It's like, why would anyone do it if it leads to this and it doesn't lead to this? Just to be clear. Now, to understand how this feedback loop gets overwhelmed, we have to talk about and we have to understand allostatic load. Now, allostatic load refers to cumulative wear and tear on your body caused by repeated and chronic stress over time. It is your body's attempt to adapt to stress. And when the load becomes too heavy, your system starts to break down. So think of it like your body is a bridge and it's built to handle a certain amount of traffic being stress. If the traffic becomes constant, like heavy trucks crossing at all hours, the bridge starts to crack. This is allostatic load. It's your body's stress burden exceeding its capacity to adapt. Now, stress is not just limited to arguments, to financial stress, to physical stress. It's the compounding factors of all of these stresses at all times and the degree in which they weigh on you, whether you disassociate or whether you acknowledge them. There are always weights associated with these stressors for probably everyone watching this. So when we look at physical stress, this can be overtraining, injury, illness, chronic pain, or even lack of sleep. So this can not only just be the input of actively doing something, but not doing enough of the right things to decrease that physical stress. Now, the stressors increase the body's demand for recovery and resources like nutrients and sleep. Now, nutrients and sleep, like food, sleep, those are the two levers that your body's going to always actively seek to offset the physical stressors as well as the emotional and mental stressors, not to mention the metabolic stressors. So when we go into mental and emotional stressors, look at like work pressures, financial concerns, relationship conflict, or grief. And you got to think, like, even at a baseline, there are probably some of you who, like, in your environments, whether that be work, home, whatever it is, you might just be sitting in an elevated state of anxiety, tension, stress. And this is one of the reasons that I think, like, if you're in that environment, you should actively try to diffuse that stress if you can. And if you're not able to diffuse it, I would actively try to change that environment. These stressors trigger the same cortisol release as physical stress, even though there's no immediate physical threat. So this is what we talk about when someone just like lives in fight or flight mode, is like they're never able to settle back down and trust, like physiologically feel safe in their environment. And this can be very real and manifest physically. Now we look at metabolic stress, chronic caloric restrictions, nutrient deficiencies, or shitty diets, blood sugar dysregulation. These things keep cortisol elevated as your body interprets it as a threat. Now, when we look past this, environmental stressors, probably confusing. You're like, well, work, relationship, those are environments. But I'm talking like quite literally like toxins, pollution, noise, endocrine disruptors like plastics. These stressors place additional strain on your body, requiring energy and resources to detoxify. So this is where being very clear about like what is the stressor, what is the catalyst for causing said feeling. And I think you need to be really clear with what that feeling is or what that stress manifests as for you. Now, when stressors keep piling up, cortisol stays elevated. Here's what happens. You see an increase in blood sugar because cortisol raises blood glucose to provide quick energy. And if you're not burning it, this triggers insulin release, leading to a propensity to insulin resistance and visceral fat storage. Now, the second point, fat redistribution. Cortisol promotes visceral fat storage because visceral fat cells are more sensitive to cortisol. This fat is fat that surrounds your organs and contributes to inflammation. Time and time again, this is something that I see very often in the fitness world within the space of competing. People will finish a show, they'll start to regain body fat, and they'll be like, yo, I've never stored body fat at my stomach, but those first 5 pounds, like that's where it sticks. It just comes on differently and it's very, very offensive. And like when you look at the catalyst for that, I mean, it's like you're coming out of a state where energy was low. You probably weren't insulin resistant, but cortisol was likely very elevated for a sustained period of time. It's not as atypical or unexpected as you might think. It's actually pretty expected given the scenario. Now you can actually see an increase in muscle breakdown. You'll see that there is elevated levels of cortisol that will then target muscle tissue to release amino acids for energy. Less muscle means a slower metabolism, making fat loss harder. Now, really big thing to catch on to here, high cortisol disrupts melatonin production, making it harder to fall asleep, stay asleep. Poor sleep further raises cortisol levels as that is a stressor and worsens insulin resistance. So you can see that chronic stress suppresses reproductive hormones like progesterone, like testosterone, leading to further fat gain and energy dysregulation. And the good news is that you can reduce allostatic load and reset this cortisol feedback loop, but it's going to come down to the basics. So prioritizing sleep, managing mental and emotional stress, balancing exercising, so not overtraining, but mixing high amounts of weight training alongside cardio that complements the state that you're in and your recovery capacity and availability. So eating to support blood sugar stability, this is just going to come down to eating micronutrient dense foods, eating whole foods, meals that are macronutriently composed in a way that support the offset of that elevated blood sugar spike post-consumption. Fiber is going to be huge here. That's also going to aid in gut regulation and support your microbiome. which is going to have direct effects on thyroid function, which, as you can see, it's like this is all interweaving related to your ability to manage this cortisol response. And it's not to say that any of these acute bouts of dysregulation are permanent, but you do need to make an active effort and be very intentional with the behaviors and your food selection as well as your program design if these things are becoming problematic and in turn impeding your fat loss. So cortisol lab testing, just getting a blood cortisol test. This is going to measure cortisol at a single point in time, typically in the morning when levels should be highest. Now, the reference range we want is up to 20, 22. If it's elevated or low, it can indicate an imbalance. But blood testing only provides a snapshot and doesn't show patterns throughout the day. So you've probably been familiar, if you yourself or you know someone who has had issues with managing cortisol levels, that there are salivary and urine cortisol tests that are called Dutch tests. These measure cortisol throughout the day, multiple time points, and also looks at cortisol metabolites. It provides a full picture of your cortisol curve, meaning morning peak, afternoon decline, and nighttime drop off. Now, a Dutch test is indicated when symptoms of cortisol imbalance are present, but blood testing is inconclusive. So these symptoms would be fatigue that doesn't improve with rest, difficulty sleeping despite feeling exhausted, stubborn belly fat despite exercise and diet, so even like fat redistribution based on what you were previously used to, hefty cravings for salty and sugary foods. But it's also helpful even when athletes are not symptomatic, or individuals who are not symptomatic who are experiencing chronic stress, to evaluate HPA, so hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis function. And we can pull other labs to make this comparison and really build a comprehensive picture as to what could be driving this dysregulation.